So next we have Jess Brillhart.
So
Jess, can people hear Jess?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great,
All right.
sorry. About a year ago, I read this book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, and it's basically a comic book that talks about the art of comics. And he did this really interesting thing at one point. He actually showed various Scott McClouds in 5 different fidelities, 5 different levels of detail. And it reminded me a lot of this, which is Pablo Picasso's The Bull, right? This idea, this notion of taking something that is essentially high fidelity and figuring out, okay, how many lines do I need to create a bull? And in Scott's case, it was how many lines does it take to make a face? And the remarkable thing is that we're really good at making faces with very minimal amount of input. Back about 5 or so years ago, actually it's probably before then, it's probably like 3 years ago, in a similar but different scenario, I was bored, and so I wanted to create the essence of the Weather Channel in the 90s, which really just involved 4 panels of the weather during the 90s and Kenny G playing, and so this is the result.
Current local conditions.
That's it. So I basically was like, well, I don't think anyone's going to care about this. And sure enough, everyone, including Kenny G, cared about it. And my favorite quote is, the Weather Channel to Kenny G is the least necessary VR experience, and we love it. So AccuWeather, 2 weeks later, not saying it had anything to do with me, released their weather channel or their weather app, and the bombardment of data and images and so on. And the same news outlets were not as kind to them. And so, looking back, from a design perspective, it wasn't like I was shocked, because, AccuWeather's thing's quite, I hope no one of you work at AccuWeather. All respect to AccuWeather, but that's grotesque, right? So, but what was really great for me was this idea that low fidelity has its use cases, right? High fidelity doesn't always need to be the thing. It's not always the answer. And Scott McCloud also said it in so much as, the user response to fidelity is drastically different along those 2 extremes, right? If something's photorealistic, they tend to think it's someone else. It's not them. But if you have a smiley face with a few lines, what we do is we instill upon that smiley face our hopes, our dreams, our experiences, and ourselves. So that becomes more about us than anything. Throughout all sorts of mediums, we've thought about fidelity, right? We thought about how an aesthetic could help tell a story. Here's an example for film. Here's an example for games, going from Atris, represented in something like Myst, to Davey Wreden's Beginner's Guide with the blockhead characters that sort of show up. And even in VR, we are also in that fidelity spectrum as well, going from the photorealistic volumetric capture of someone all the way to a brightly lit ball with 2 eyes, which was Where Thoughts Go. And it gives me pause, because what we've done is we have fidelity, and fidelity's always just been this thing that we just remains constant through an entire experience. But life isn't like that, and we're getting better at actually embracing that we all live on kind of a spectrum of experience that we rock. We are different people every second of every day, depending on the situation. I'm not like this normally, where I just talk profoundly to everybody all the time. I'm very different when I wake up, when I go to sleep, when I do talks, etc. So I feel like we work in a medium where we can actually embrace the way that we rock that gradient a bit more than we have in the past. And so I have a theory, just food for thought. Bringing back up the Scott McCloud gradient again. Imagine, if you will, a VR sandbox that presents various situations every so often. So say in this sandbox at that particular time, it's about it's about teaching me how to use a tractor. So if I had to choose a fidelity for learning how to deal with a tractor, I would probably go over here. Because if the virtual tractor is different from the real world tractor, then I'm in trouble. Because if there's a button that isn't there because of whatever, and I go to the real world and there is a button, it's going to be very confusing. So if the purpose is that, the fidelity needs to be high, because reality is actually really important. But say I go to a concert and I don't really want anyone to know that I'm there, I may want to go here, anonymity. I go on a virtual date. I may want to be somewhere in here. I don't want to give too much information out, but I also don't want to seem like I'm hiding something either, so I may want to be here. And the point I'm trying to make is we can be all of these things at the same time. We don't need to have one aesthetic. We can be multiple aesthetics that we rock or an intelligent system will rock for us depending on the context. So you can imagine an intelligent system knows that we're in a training environment, so it decides to make the world high fidelity. It knows we're in a particular place where anonymity might be key, and it rocks us down to something that's a little bit more lo-fi. Quantum, a little shout out to superposition, talk to Samantha about that, is the fact that the quantum principle that a quantum system can be in multiple states at the same time, and it's only when you measure that state that it actually exists as anything. So this is very much about the way the universe works as well, and we can actually embrace that now, which I think is something we should think about. So there's this crisis of identity, where if we're all these things at the same time, who are we? And then in the deepfake realm, if visual representation is elusive and perhaps wrong, how can we trust anything from a visual perspective? So I have a bonus theory, which is kind of based on Ken Perlin's The Walkers, where he took motion capture data and put it in these little trapezoids, and you can basically tell who the mom is and who the kid is, right? And they're just 3D basic geometric shapes. New York Times actually wrote about this too, something in the way we move, where we actually have a very specific way that we move, each of us. Our gaits are different. You can recognize your friend down the street if you don't see them by the way that they're walking. And so we have in us this internal resonance, this internal pillar, a fingerprint that is basically us. So even though our visual is in flux, there is this key component to us, which I think is the kind of bedrock for the waters of existence that we've created for ourselves. And that's just a hunch anyway, and it's just food for thought. So thank you.